Hello Riverland. I promised you a video near water, this little stream that I love so much that runs through my township. And I hope you can see it in the back there. I'm trying to observe the rule of thirds once in a while as an amateur videographer. And I'm in one of the most beautiful forests I'm aware of here in central Minnesota. And I'm always happy to be near water. I'm all about the elements. I think I've already mentioned that. Fire, air, water, and the ground. And I don't even know if this stream has a name, but some of the water in my lake is running through here. I'm about 2 miles away from my house. And I was saddened to hear that you don't have any lakes down in Mower County to speak of, according to Kelly, my dean there, but I know you have rivers. So here's what I have for you today. We're going to start out with a poem by Terrence Hayes, just 1 minute and I think 53 seconds. Terrence is a 6'7" African-American man, National Book Award professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm really fond of his poetry. And we'll start with him. Then I got a story to tell you, kind of a companion story to the one I told you the other day. And then we're going to end up our time today wondering about metaphor. We've got two threads running right now. One of them is the idea of being persuasive, studying persuasion, argumentation. And I'm not done talking about style yet. And you can't have a unit on style without dealing with figurative language, with the power of metaphor. So just a quick thing about Terrence before I spin this vid for you. Terrence, the year that I brought him to Central Lakes College around 2015, he was declared that year by People magazine to be the sexiest writer alive. Okay? And that's how I pitched the reading. I'm like, everybody, you got to come because he's the sexiest writer alive. And sure enough, 285 plus people packed that Trollberg, people sitting on the stairs. And for a split second, I thought, I should just bring writers that are, hot, sexy. That's what I'll do from here on out. That's what'll fill the theater. Of course, I had that thought for about 5 minutes and then I let it go. But here's Terrence Hayes.
Cocktails with Orpheus. After dark, the bar full of women part of me loves, the part that stood naked outside the window of Miss Geneva, recent divorcee who owned a gun. Oh, Miss Geneva, where are you now? Orpheus says she did not perish. She was not turned to ash in the brutal light. She found a good job. She made good money. She had her own insurance and a house. She was a decent wife. I know decent lives in the word descent. The bar noise makes a kind of silence. When Orpheus hands me his sunglasses, I see how fire changes everything. In the mind, I am behind a woman whose skirt is hiked above her hips, as bound as touch permits, saying, "Don't forget me when I become the liquid out of which names are born. Salt milk, milk sweet and animal made. I want to be human above the body, uprooted and right, a fold of pleas released, but I am a black wound, what's left of the deed."
Okay, this is another one of those kind of down and dirty application stories with rhetorical theory. And if I don't tell you a story once in a while and make it concrete, I'm just going to get lost in the clouds where abstract random people like me like to be. The other day I told you a story on Monday to start our week about a day where I truly misused language when I was 18 years old, and I hold myself responsible for that. Hit a little button called homophobia. That's the form that non-essentials can take. It can be like a sleight of hand. You distract someone from the issue at hand. And if you're going to attack someone, that's a pretty sure and clear way to do that. Now here's a quick story that I think is not going to put before you the idea of wrong rhetoric, but gray rhetoric. I think this one's a little bit more morally ambiguous. And the gist of it is this. My little house, which is 2 miles through the woods here, across a couple lakes, when I built it, application story, I got a crazy idea. The crazy idea was that I would contract it myself, right? And if you do that, that means you hire all the people, right? You hire all the stout-hearted dudes, although the painter was a woman. You hire the electrician, you hire the plumber, the sheetrock guy, the carpenters, everything, excavators. And I should not have done that because I had no idea what I was even doing. And I'll tell you a little something about living in the country. I don't know what the soil's like down there, but we got heavy clay here in central Minnesota, in Stearns County. And if you're going to build a house, you have to have something called a perk test, in the country anyway. And a perk test is this simple. You pay a guy $150 to come out to your land, dig a hole, and then pour a gallon of water in the hole, one shovelful. And then the dude sits in his truck and stares at his watch and times it. And how fast that water absorbs into that hole determines what kind of septic you got. And you want it to go away really quickly so you can get a conventional septic system instead of a mound. Now, I don't want this class to turn into a tutorial on septic systems, but that was a pretty big moment for me to find out, yeah, you can get away with a conventional system. It's a difference of about $20,000 between the two. But this guy just wasn't coming. I kept calling him saying, could you come do the perk test? He just kept saying, oh, Jeff, I'll get out there before the snow flies. Don't worry. So the day I went to get my permit, try to get the story going, I show up at Environmental Services in St. Cloud. And there was a sweetheart of a man named Ed behind the counter, who I'm sorry to report has since died of ALS. I love that guy. And I showed up and I had this pile of stuff. I wanted my building permit, the county building permit. I already had the township building permit. I plopped it all on the desk and I said, Ed, I got everything but the perk test. And he pushed it back to me very gently and he said, Ed, or Jeff, you need your perk test. I can't give you your county building permit until you got that. It doesn't matter if you have everything else. I'm like, okay, Ed, I'll go nag the guy some more. And I got home like that day or the next day, the phone rings in this crap rental bungalow that we were living in between houses. And it's my concrete guy. And he's like, you know what? If I don't pour those walls by, make sure this cable's not in the way. If I don't pour those walls now, Jeff, I'm not going to get in there till October. And I panicked a little bit because, excuse me, I wanted to help the carpenters, right? I wanted to work with them. You know, you can save a lot of money just cleaning up the job site. And I panicked and a little bit, and I did something I should not have done. This is clearly unethical. I called the excavator and I said, dig a hole. We're ready to go. It's all staked out. He said, did you get your building permits? I said, yeah. Well, it was a half fib because I only had one. I had the township permit, but not the county. So Jeff Lang, who just fixed my driveway last week while I was making one of these vids, he comes out and he digs the hole. And Mark Saldana comes in. You don't want to build a house out of concrete block. Don't do that. Pour a solid concrete wall. It'll feel like a fort and it won't leak water or radon. So a little while after that, this is where I got in trouble. I come home one day and to my new home, emerging home, and there's a note on the trusses. And it said, Jeff, call me immediately. Ed, Environmental Services, Stearns County. So I call him up and he's like, Jeff, what have you done out there? I said, what are you talking about, Ed? He said, you dug a hole, you poured walls, you didn't have your permit yet. I said, Ed, it's okay now. I got my perk test. Everything's fine. He said, okay, bring it in along with all the rest of your paperwork, but this time out, you better bring your checkbook. That didn't sound good. And I show up and Ed's like, okay, I'll give you your county building permit, but you have got to write out a check for $500 as a fine. I'm like, what? So my boss, Don Adams, says that I have to assess you a $500 after the fact building permit because you dug the hole without it. I'm like, oh crap, that's a lot of money. That's like a super nice toilet, right? When you're building a house, you're counting every penny. So I wrote out the check and I gave it to him and I said, okay, Ed, now I want out of it. I want to get out of this. And he said, no one's ever gotten out of it. We give this fine all the time. No one's ever talked their way out of it. I said, Ed, if I wanted to talk my way out of it, what would be the method? He said, well, I think you're wasting your time, but I can put you on the county commissioner's schedule and you can appear in public and you can argue it. I said, okay, put me down. And about a month later, I went in there and like 7 senior citizens, right? It's like the tribunal of elders. And they're wearing flannel, and they're actually above me a little bit. And there's like 80 people behind me waiting their turn. And I clicked on the mic, and they were like, okay, Mr. Johnson, what do you have to say for yourself? You started up building a house without a permit. I said, I did, okay? I did this, but you guys, I wasn't building a secret house. I've been working with the county now from the beginning. My house is in a protected area, so everybody had to sign off on it. Everybody. Fisheries, wildlife, DNR, Soil and Conservation, Army Corps of Engineers, because I got a driveway that goes through a lake bed. And I get near the end of this, and I said, I talked for about a minute and a half, and at the end I put my hands over my heart, because gestures are very important in rhetoric. Renaissance rhetorical textbooks have pages of just gestures, how to hold your hands and stuff, facial expressions, etc. I looked into the heavy-lidded eyes of the 7 senior citizens in flannel. I put my hands on my heart and I said, okay, listen, I'm a Catholic school teacher, and while I do feel that I should be fined some amount of money, I really feel that $500 is an egregious sum to fine my little family with. I use the phrase little family. Bam, that was it. One guy goes instantly angry. He says, I make a motion that we return Jeff Johnson's $401 and keep 99. And I'm like, that sounds pretty, I didn't say it, but I thought, that sounds pretty good. And this guy who's a very old man now, who lives in Farming Township, the next one over, Frank Colhorst, he got angry. And he said, I make a different motion. I make a motion that we give Jeff Johnson his $500 back and then pay him another $500 to have to come in here and argue this. And parliamentary procedure confusion, right? Motion piled upon a motion. They had violated Robert's Rules of Order. Well, at the end, I was the first person in the history of the county to get that money back, or a bunch of it. And I was pretty happy about it. And Ed followed me out into the hallway. He had about 3 years to live then. He didn't know, and he threw his arms around me and hugged me. He came to love me. But his boss, wow, was Don Adams mad that I got that money back. Now, we can't do this interactively, because it's a YouTube video. But this morning I asked my 9 o'clock and my 10 o'clock Comp 1 sections, did I do anything unethical? Well, they didn't, they thought so. They used the word, one student said, you manipulated those elderly people. I said, whoa, that's a word that rhetoricians don't want to hear very often. Manipulate sounds psychologic. And I pushed back at them. I said, hey, I didn't lie, did I? Well, they know what I was doing. I was pushing buttons, right? That's the unethical part. That's the gray part, the morally ambiguous part. I knew at Stearns County, Germans and Poles here, I knew that half of the Stearns County commissioners were going to be Catholic, and the other half were going to be sympathetic Lutherans, right? And little family, what did I mean by that, right? I did have a little family, 2 boys only, but the way I've used the phrase, it conjured the image of me in the wilderness, right? Gathering my boys around with my wife and tumbleweeds going by. Not one of those commissioners had the wherewithal or the rhetorical training to say, wait a minute, man, that's a rhetorical non-essential. You're building a lake home on 20 acres, by the way, and your wife is a med-surg nurse. Well, with the Catholic thing, I was also trying to let them know that I didn't make a lot of money, but I got the money back. So I'm repeating the idea again because you got to get it. There's right rhetoric, wrong rhetoric, and I'm interested in what's in between sometimes. The area that's gray, where we're scratching our head and going, was that the right thing to do? Was that the best way to go? And that's my story. We're not done talking about rhetoric, but I want to switch gears to style for a minute before I go to a bigger, better teacher to get some help. And I'm always wondering how long I'm taking here to get these vids out. I think I'm doing okay. The study of metaphor is endless. Okay, there's just no bottom to it. I told my students this morning, and I'll tell you the same thing. I once happened on a book in the basement of the Alcuin Library, which is through the trees here at St. John's. And I'm just cruising along, and I saw this big, thick book that had metaphor on the spine. I thought, well, this is a book about metaphor. I took it down and picked it up. It wasn't exactly a book on metaphor. It was like an 800-page bibliography on metaphor, pointing to thousands of articles and books on metaphor. I got my feet up on the coolest, biggest rock right now. Wish you could see it. Maybe I'll show it to you later. That's what I got my tripod on, my little one. So here are my thoughts on metaphor. Let me give you some Jeff Johnson thoughts before we turn to Peter Geary, who's an expert on metaphor. Professor Geary. We'll do a TED Talk, if you don't mind. It's only 10 minutes long. Couple thoughts. I.A. Richards teaches me, he was kind of a weirdo that taught at Harvard in the late 30s. Worst hair in the history of rhetoric. Invented his own punctuation system and then used it to write his books. Didn't make any sense. And the punctuation was weird too. I.A. Richards says that metaphor is a 3-part thing, really. You begin with something called the tenor, and you got something on the other end called the vehicle. And what emerges in between is the comparison, the comparing of one thing to another, or as Geary will put it, x equals y. And I love it when the two things being compared are far apart. I'm really fascinated by metaphors that strain at the breaking point. So obviously, to demonstrate it, I can go to Shakespeare and say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art lovelier and more temperate. Okay, dead simple. Summer's day, beautiful woman, a lover trying to make headway, and in between we get beauty. That's what the comparison is. But metaphor is often layered too. So yes, we have the idea that she's beautiful, but there's also a sadness there if you don't feel it in that sonnet, which is that summer days don't last very long, and you're not going to be beautiful forever, I guess is one way of thinking of it. We all get old, that's the idea. A second observation that I want to make about metaphor, I keep bringing up This American Life because it's my favorite radio program, but a number of years ago I heard an amazing story on that radio show of mine that was about a guy whose body completely stopped producing testosterone, like completely. You know, we have three hormones, whether you're a dude or a woman. We have women have dominantly estrogen. Men like me have still a little testosterone. And there's a little mix of progesterone in there too. But this man, for whatever reason, his body just stopped producing testosterone. He went to zero. And he didn't report it as being unpleasant. There was just a strangeness to life for a little while, right? For one thing, doing something or not doing something in terms of human activity was like the same thing. Watching a TV that was turned off was the same thing to him as watching a TV that was turned on. And you can guess that he lost a little bit of interest in his girlfriend for a while, until the doctors figured out what was wrong with him and started giving him testosterone shots, which he's probably still getting on a weekly basis to restore his dudeness. But the most fascinating thing about that story to me was that the guy reported that when his body stopped producing testosterone, he completely lost the ability to think symbolically, metaphorically. Everything became concrete in the world. So when he walked through a park and he saw a squirrel, he would go, there's a squirrel. Or when he would look up at the sky, right, it wasn't the vaunted blue, it was just the sky. And a tree, for instance, could never be anything more than just a tree to him. He couldn't see the crown of a tree, like a king, or the architecture of a tree, as Czeslaw Miłosz puts it. Everything became concrete until he started getting the supplements, which tells us something about metaphor and desire, because hormones make us go, desire makes us go. And I'm just struck by how interesting that is. James Geary is an expert. We're going to turn to him next and we'll let him take it out here today. James Geary is a PhD. He's written a number of books on metaphoric thinking. He also has an interest in aphorisms, which I share. Aphorism is a fancy word for like a wise saying that always has an implicit truth. And you've heard a million of them. Can't teach an old dog new tricks, the early bird gets the worm, etc. And I love them, and I love thinking about them and playing with them as tools, equipment in the classroom. Maybe later I'll tell you an experiment that I conduct every year with 3 very different aphorisms. I think we'll talk about that when we get to reading issues. Well, I'm glad I got here to this little spot in the woods by this stream that I just love so much. You'd be amazed in a little while. It just, the terrain changes and it's roaring white water. I mean, it really becomes something. It doesn't look like much now maybe, but anyway, I hope you all end up near water like I did. It's important. Find yourself a river, find yourself a little lake. We'll see you next time out. We'll see you on Friday.
Metaphor lives a secret life all around us. We utter about 6 metaphors a minute. Metaphorical thinking is essential to how we understand ourselves and others, how we communicate, learn, discover, and invent. But metaphor is a way of thought before it is a way with words. Now, to assist me in explaining this, I've enlisted the help of one of our greatest philosophers. the reigning king of the metaphorians, a man whose contributions to the field are so great that he himself has become a metaphor. I am, of course, referring to none other than Elvis Presley. Now, All Shook Up is a great love song. It's also a great example of how whenever we deal with anything abstract, ideas, emotions, feelings, concepts, thoughts, we inevitably resort to metaphor. In All Shook Up, a touch is not a touch, but a chill. Lips are not lips, but volcanoes. She is not she, but a buttercup. And love is not love, but being all shook up. In this, Elvis is following Aristotle's classic definition of metaphor as the process of giving the thing a name that belongs to something else. This is the mathematics of metaphor. And fortunately, it's very simple. X equals Y. This formula works wherever metaphor is present. Elvis uses it, but so does Shakespeare. In his famous line from Romeo and Juliet, Juliet is the sun. Now here, Shakespeare gives the thing, Juliet, a name that belongs to something else, the sun. But whenever we give a thing a name that belongs to something else, we give it a whole network of analogies too. We mix and match what we know about the metaphor's source, in this case the sun, with what we know about its target, Juliet. And metaphor gives us a much more vivid understanding of Juliet than if Shakespeare had literally described what she looks like. So, how do we make and understand metaphors? This might look familiar. The first step is pattern recognition. Look at this image. What do you see? 3 wayward packmen and 3 pointy brackets are actually present. What we see, however, are 2 overlapping triangles. Metaphor is not just the detection of patterns, it is the creation of patterns. Second step, conceptual synesthesia. Now, synesthesia is the experience of a stimulus in one sense organ in another sense organ as well, such as colored hearing. People with colored hearing actually see colors when they hear the sounds of words or letters. We all have synesthetic abilities. This is the Buba Kiki test. What you have to do is identify which of these shapes is called Buba and which is called Kiki. If you're like 98% of other people, you will identify the round amoeboid shape as Buba and the sharp spiky one as Kiki. Can we do a quick show of hands? Does that correspond? Okay, I think 99.9 would about cover it. Why do we do that? Because we instinctively find or create a pattern between the round shape and the round sound of Buba and the spiky shape and the spiky sound of Kiki. And many of the metaphors we use every day are synesthetic. Silence is sweet. Neckties are loud. Sexually attractive people are hot. Sexually unattractive people leave us cold. Metaphor creates a kind of conceptual synesthesia in which we understand one concept in the context of another. The third step is cognitive dissonance. This is the stroke test. What you need to do here is identify as quickly as possible the color of the ink in which these words are printed. You can take the test now. If you're like most people, you will experience a moment of cognitive dissonance when the name of the color is printed in a differently colored ink. The test shows that we cannot ignore the literal meaning of words, even when the literal meaning gives the wrong answer. Strobe tests have been done with metaphor as well, and participants had to identify as quickly as possible the literally false sentences. They took longer to reject metaphors as false than they did to reject literally false sentences. Why? Because we cannot ignore the metaphorical meaning of words either. One of the sentences was, "Some jobs are jails." Now, unless you're a prison guard, the sentence, "Some jobs are jails," is literally false. Sadly, it's metaphorically true, and the metaphorical truth interferes with our ability to identify it as literally false. Metaphor matters because it's around us every day all the time. Metaphor matters because it creates expectations. Pay careful attention the next time you read the financial news. Agent metaphors describe price movements as the deliberate action of a living thing, as in the Nasdaq climbed higher. Object metaphors describe price movements as non-living things, as in the Dow fell like a brick. Researchers asked a group of people to read a clutch of market commentaries and then predict the next day's price trend. Those exposed to agent metaphors had higher expectations that the price trends would continue. They had those expectations because agent metaphors imply the deliberate action of a living thing pursuing a goal. If, for example, house prices are routinely described as climbing and climbing higher and higher, people might naturally assume that that rise is unstoppable. They may feel confident, say, in taking out mortgages they really can't afford. Now, that's a hypothetical example, of course, but this is how metaphor misleads. Metaphor also matters because it influences decisions by activating analogies. A group of students was told that a small democratic country had been invaded and had asked the US for help, and they had to make a decision. What should they do? Intervene, appeal to the UN, or do nothing? They were each then given one of three descriptions of this hypothetical crisis, each of which was designed to trigger a different historical analogy. World War II, Vietnam, and the third was historically neutral. Those exposed to the World War II scenario made more interventionist recommendations than the others. Just as we cannot ignore the literal meaning of words, we cannot ignore the analogies that are triggered by metaphor. Metaphor matters because it opens the door to discovery. Whenever we solve a problem or make a discovery, we compare what we know with what we don't know. And the only way to find out about the latter is to investigate the ways it might be like the former. Einstein described his scientific method as combinatory play. He famously used thought experiments, which are essentially elaborate analogies, to come up with some of his greatest discoveries. By bringing together what we know and what we don't know through analogy, metaphorical thinking strikes the spark that ignites discovery. Now, metaphor is ubiquitous, yet it's hidden. But you just have to look at the words around you, and you'll find it. Ralph Waldo Emerson described language as fossil poetry. But before it was fossil poetry, language was fossil metaphor. And these fossils still breathe. Take the three most famous words in all of Western philosophy: cogito ergo sum. That's routinely translated as I think, therefore I am. But there's a better translation. The Latin word cogito is derived from the prefix co, meaning together, and the verb agitare, meaning to shake. So the original meaning of cogito is to shake together. And the proper translation of cogito ergo sum is I shake things up, therefore I am. Metaphor shakes things up, giving us everything from Shakespeare to scientific discovery in the process. The mind is a plastic snow dome, most beautiful, most interesting, and most itself when, as Elvis put it, it's all shook up. And metaphor keeps the mind shaking, rattling, and rolling long after Elvis has left the building. Thank you very much.